Hello, my name is Hisham Zerriffi. I am with the Faculty of Forestry of the University of British Columbia, and I'd like to thank the International Society of Tropical Foresters and the International Forestry Working Group of the Society of American Foresters for this invitation to participate in this online symposium on fuelwood in the tropics. My goal for today's talk is to unpack some of the complex social and ecological relationships that exist between household energy and forests, with some examples of research done within my research group and with other collaborators. To start, we need to discuss a bit the scale of wood fuel usage and why we're even having a symposium such as this one. There are over 2 billion people relying on biomass fuels for their basic cooking and heating needs globally. FAO estimates about 50% of roundwood extraction from forests is for fuel, including commercial fuels, but in some countries, over 80 to 90% of the roundwood extraction is for fuel and primarily for meeting this basic cooking and heating need. A lot of the global concern around clean cooking has been then put into the Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which calls for clean cooking for all by 2030. And this is largely driven by concerns around health, gender equity, and environment. We'll note that this goal is not on target at the moment, and significant additional resources need to be put in to meet that Sustainable Development Goal. The common fuelwood forest message that is given out there is that the more biomass that is used versus growth of biomass in the forest means that the forest is being used unsustainably. The common metric for this is the fraction of non-renewable biomass being harvested, and this is important for doing things like calculating carbon credits, or often used as a proxy for forest impacts, and is an extremely useful metric, one that you'll hear more about by some of my other symposium collaborators. However, the common message that comes out of this more broadly has then become that home biomass use is equal to deforestation, equal to climate change. And this has been a recurring issue in this field where there is a linkage made between the use of biomass for cooking and heating in homes, collected biomass for cooking and heating in homes, and deforestation, which implies a relatively large and persistent land use change. And going way back to the late 70s and early 80s, this has been an ongoing contestation. So we see this big emphasis around carbon and deforestation that occurs. For example, the Clean Cooking Alliance talks about the environmental impacts of cooking with biomass and in open fires and inefficient stoves as contributing to climate change, sea ice melt, and deforestation. Note that term, deforestation. When you dig a little bit deeper into some of the materials, though, we do see statements like this: up to 34% of wood fuel harvested is unsustainable, contributing to forest degradation and climate change. And that is likely more accurate in some ways for large parts of the world than the deforestation question. Minimoto, a company that sells an improved cookstove, also first starts talking about forest degradation, repeating the language from the Clean Cooking Alliance, but later on, when talking about the amount of saved fuel in their stove, talks about the possibility to stop deforestation and regenerate a country's forest cover. Similarly, the Global LPG Partnership, which promotes the use of liquefied petroleum gas as a replacement for biomass use, talks about severe deforestation as an impact of conventional use of biomass. Now, it is not to say that there is no linkage between biomass cooking and deforestation, but that is often limited to places where there's charcoal production, which does require a large amount of biomass in areas where there's not great forest cover. But in large parts of the world, we're not necessarily talking about people going in and undertaking land use change in order to extract the biomass that they need. Why is this really important for the cooking clean cookstove community? In part is because the fraction non-renewable biomass and this idea that there's unsustainable harvesting of biomass is important for creating carbon credits. And so you see this quote from Molly Brown, head of carbon strategy at Burn Manufacturing. What's been really transformative are carbon credits. They allowed us to scale. The money coming in from carbon credits, which is predicated in large part around this unsustainable harvesting of biomass, is what allows some of these programs to implement and diffuse new technologies. And that is a great thing. We don't necessarily want to see that go away, but we do need to have perhaps a better understanding if we really want to know what the implications are of biomass usage for fuel on forests. We need to have perhaps a broader understanding than just simply the carbon and the deforestation, as important as that may be in some parts. And so the goal of this talk is to talk a little bit more about social and ecological linkages that go beyond carbon and deforestation. And really, it's about thinking about what and how forest resources are collected, the relationship that actually has to land use change and other forest activities, the role of farm resources, which can act as a substitute or complement to forest biomass resources for households, household decision-making around technologies and fuels and harvesting, and the various global and national energy and climate change priorities and programs. Now, I'm not going to cover all of these bullets in this talk, but these are the kinds of things we need to start thinking about and talking about and understanding better in order to get that broader perspective on the relationship between household energy choice and forest impacts. And I liken this to what I would call a gray box problem as opposed to a black box problem. In that there's a lot of people who work on that household energy choice, which see the wood coming in from the forest, but don't really pay much attention to what that implies for actual forests. So you see things like measurement of total wood consumption from forests, but not necessarily thinking about how that's been harvested, what's been harvested, and what the implications are for forest health, for example. Similarly, those working in the forestry sector often are very cognizant of the fact that there's wood being extracted for home fuel usage, but aren't necessarily paying attention to the dynamics happening at that household level in terms of why and how people are choosing to meet their energy service needs and what that implies for forests. And so the goal is to sort of unpack these gray box problems a little bit overall. So the first thing we can think about is, why do people collect? I'm not going to go into great detail into this diagram, but this is an example of some of the work being done in my Energy Resources Development and Environment Lab, trying to better understand the drivers of change that will move people from using biomass over to something like LPG. And it involves thinking about people's attitudes, the norms and social influences that might exist, the facilitating conditions that exist, their habits, and also the behavior change aspects of it as people make decisions around adopting new technology and moving up towards using that as a primary cooking fuel. And it's really important to think about this as a much more complex problem than simply people's incomes, for example, being the only driver of them switching from biomass fuels to other fuels. It's a much more complex problem in terms of the decision-making happening in the household. And this was published in a paper in Energy Research and Social Science. Another thing we can do is look at farmers and their decision-making. And this is people not just collecting, but actually harvesting. In Chile is where we looked at this, where they're actually harvesting for a commercial wood fuel market into urban centers. And here again, these are complex decision-making environments where farmers are looking at their on-farm resources, their off-farm resources at multiple scales and trying to make decisions that are best for their own well-being. It's not, again, simply a question of prices or incomes, though that plays a large role. And so we can see things like you see on the right, where we look at the percent native forest cover on the x-axis and their on-farm incomes on the y-axis, and look at who are the fuelwood producers. Those are the blue dots, and non-fuel producers are the black dots. The top is for farms where there's no forest plantation, and the bottom is with a forest plantation. And you can, if you look at this a little bit more carefully, you would see that actually really shifts the decision making in many ways, in terms of when farmers are willing to produce fuel wood, and what pressure that might imply for native forest cover. And you can see that when you have a plantation in the bottom graph, that farmers are producing fuel wood at much lower percentages of native forest cover because they're able to go to the plantation to do so. This was published in Energy for Sustainable Development with my colleagues Renee Reyes and Harry Nelson. We can also think about where people collect. So it's not that you have a village, for example, in India, and there's sort of a circle radius of, let's say, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers, and the people just simply go and collect in that radius. What we did in this particular study, led by Devyani Singh, is to provide GPS units to women in villages, and as you can see, 5 villages in rural India, denoted by those codes, and then we constructed a home range using something called home range analysis to look at the directionality and spread and distance that household people went to for collecting the fuel wood. And you can see it's quite specific. They're going very specific places to collect that fuel wood. And that is a function of both the farm resources and roadside shrubbery and things like that, where they can collect in some parts, as well as where the forests are, and in relationship to the village. So it's a very directional approach that they take, and this is necessary to understand in terms of thinking about where exactly collection happens and what people are collecting. This was published, again, in Energy for Sustainable Development a few years ago. You can even think about what do people collect, and in that same basic study, we have study sites in the north, in the state of in town near Kulu, and in the south near Kopal. And you can see that due to the differences in the types of farming practices, forest availability, and these kinds of things, that we see quite a bit of a difference, where in Kulu, 70% of households collect from both the farm and the forest, and 26% just collect from the forest. In Kopal, we see only about close to 60% collect from both farm and forest, but 38% collect from the farm. So quite a bit of difference there between those two study sites in terms of what people are relying on farms versus forests for their biomass. Again, published in Energy for Sustainable Development. Switching to a place, again, going back to Chile, where it's a much more commercial wood fuel market and people are purchasing their fuels, we can ask, what do people want to consume? So thinking again about not just that all wood is the same, and so if we go in and say, well, this amount of wood is being extracted from the forest, well, what kind of wood, what kind of species, what does that imply? Here we can see the results of a survey where we asked people their first, second, and third choices for different tree species, and you can see their common names there in Chile, Tepu, Luma, and Ulmo being the most predominant. And you can see a flow between first and second choice species. If one looks at eucalyptus, for example, that sort of darker blue, only a small number of households select that as their first choice, a little bit more on their second choice, and then even more on their third choice. And so that, that species choice actually matters, because that has different implications depending on whether you're talking about plantation trees or native forest trees, for example. We also see, in fact, that not everybody gets their preferred choice. Those who choose eucalyptus, some do get their preferred choice, but many have to choose other species. Many who choose Luma, Tepu, Ulma, or Huale do get their first choice, but for a number of the other species, they're not getting their preferred choice, and that comes about for a variety of factors in terms of availability, cost, and these kinds of things. And this is a manuscript draft that we have under review, thinking about the implications for native forests in the south of Chile of this question around tree species preference. We can also ask what happens when we do have some of these clean cook stove implementation programs to switch to improved cook stoves or LPG or something similar. And again, we can see context really matters. The graphs you're looking at are for the difference, the change in kilograms per household per day for total farm and forests, control households and treatment households, with Kulu, again, that's a northern Indian site on the left, and Kopal, a southern Indian site on the right, where you saw again those differences between where they like to collect. And if we look at the last two, the kind of greenish bars, you can see both control and treatment went down. Treatment a little bit more in Kulu up in the north when households had the opportunity to get a intervention stove, whereas very little changed for the forest consumption in Kopal. Big changes instead in the farm consumption in Kopal. And we hypothesize here is that in Kopal, for example, the forest is quite a ways away. It's not a particularly big forest. And so if people are going to go to the forest, they're going to collect a full set of a full load of wood that they bring back every time they go. Whereas the farm collection is mostly roadside shrubbery and things on trees on farm and these kinds of things. And it's easy for them to sort of just reduce their consumption of that in response to the reduced need for fuel wood. But that forest being far enough away that they're just going to maximize how much they extract each time that they go. So point here is these are complex social ecological systems, but I'd actually like to expand even beyond that to it's not just a social ecological system, but a social technical ecological system. This is a complex decision-making environment in multifunctional landscapes where we have farms and forests, and where technology development and adoption is really important. So if we really want to understand the system, if we really want to understand this relationship between household technology choice and fuel choice and decision making and farm and forest biomass resources, we need to move beyond simply looking at carbon stock balances. We need to be much more careful about talking about deforestation versus forest degradation. So what's the implication of pulling out certain species preferentially from the forest as opposed to a large-scale land use change that deforestation implies? What does that do to the forest structure and function? And these are the really kind of important questions I think that we need to answer. And so I would conclude with a research agenda for forests and fuel woods for those within these two societies. Right? We need improved measurement and understanding of forest degradation versus deforestation. We need to think about multi-sector approaches to understanding household energy and forests. So energy people's, often within their own sphere, forest people often within their own sphere, but it's actually broader than that. Because of the health impacts of cooking with biomass, health sector needs to come into play. Because of the gender equity implications of who collects and who cooks with biomass, we need to have the sectors that are concerned around gender equity and social equity being part of it. Because the implications for time use and education for kids who might be spending time, particularly girls spending time collecting, the education sector needs to be involved, as well as others. And so this is really a multi-sector problem that we really need to bring all of those perspectives to bear on thinking about this. It's not just a forest problem or an energy problem. We need a better understanding of household technology choice and biomass resources and any feedback loops that might exist. How do household technology choices and implementation programs to incentivize those choices impact forests? How do forest biomass and farm biomass availability impact the choices that people are actually making and their response to those incentives? And how do policies then feedback between those two sectors in some way, especially if they're not necessarily coordinated? And we also, I think, need to distinguish fuel wood extraction within the context of multiple drivers of forest change. We have fuel wood extraction for sure, but we also have extraction for construction industry, pulp and paper, and a variety of other uses, as well as, of course, broader environmental changes like climate change. And the role that fuel wood extraction actually has within that gets often very muddied, such that we get this conflation between fuel wood extraction and deforestation or other types of impacts when those may actually be driven by other land uses and drivers of forest extraction. I'd like to acknowledge the Erde Lab research team and alumni from the team, Abhishek, Devyani, Renee, and Dawit, who have been involved in these various studies that I just showed you. Many collaborators over the years, Rob Bayless, Puneet Vivadi, Valame, Sarah Gergel, Harry Nelson, the organizations Samuha, Jagriti, and Infor, with whom we've collaborated over the years. The particular projects I showed were funded by, particularly by EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S., and SSHRC, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, and the various research participants who allowed us to come in and measure their fuel wood and do various other things and answer all our questions on our surveys. Thank you, and for more information, you can visit my lab website, find me on Mastodon, or email me directly at UBC.